Thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Karen Romero. I direct the Freedom Network Training Institute, which I'll share a little bit more about what that is and the activities that we're taking and the efforts that we're taking under the Institute in a few moments. So some logistics just to keep in mind, everyone's muted at this point. All participants are muted. And if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box. As we compile these, we'll be able to answer them towards the end. Also, if you have any technical difficulties, if you can't hear us, or if you have difficulties reading the slides, any sort of glitches, go ahead and put them in the box, in that Q&A box, and that will alert us to those. As you put any sort of question in the box or any sort of comment in that Q&A box, just know that due to confidentiality, once we are answering those at the end, we will not disclose your name. So please feel free to share any questions that you may have there. And you can you can ask throughout the webinar, or you can also hold those towards the end. We'll, again, be compiling those and making sure we address them at the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available in about a week. We'll be sending it out to participants, and also we'll be uploading it on the Freedom Network USA website. And we'll go ahead and get started. So we want to thank everyone for joining today's call and today's webinar. Really, it is around covering the importance of housing and housing assessments for survivors of human trafficking and understanding housing options for this population. We know that housing is the #1 need, if not definitely in the top 3 needs of survivors. And oftentimes that is one of the resources that really will allow people to obtain and access other opportunities such as employment and ongoing healing. So we want to make sure that we are addressing some potential options and that you are able to understand just what resources may be out there for you. To tell you a little bit more about this project and about the Institute, Freedom Network Training Institute is the training arm of Freedom Network USA. And Freedom Network USA is the largest coalition of advocates and service providers working directly with survivors of human trafficking within the US. And we really take the human rights-based approach as far as understanding the core issues, thinking about root causes of human trafficking, ensuring that all of our training and materials are survivor-centered and trauma-informed. And also we very much strive to include survivor voice at the center of all of our materials, all of our work. And so we want you to know that that is very intentional on our end, is ensuring that we're working very much in collaboration with those with lived experience. This Freedom Network Housing Training and Technical Assistance Project is meant to really address the issue of housing with survivors of human trafficking. This is an OVC funded project, and throughout the remainder of the project, our goal is to address the need for housing for survivors. And that is thinking through not just what is available currently, but also options that as service providers we may not be accessing quite yet, specifically long-term stable housing. We really want to make that connection between the resources that exist in the housing and homeless world and the anti-trafficking service providers. So we really want to be intentional on really drawing that bridge and making sure that we as a field understand what's available for us. Through this project, we're going to have bi-monthly trainings such as this that will cover various topics specifically around housing. So we'll be able to share more about that, and we have a resource library that will include all of these materials that are developed for this project, but also promising practices and other reports from service providers throughout the US and throughout different sectors that have existing work and promising practices that could be beneficial to our work. So we want to go ahead and introduce you to the speakers for today. We are very excited to have this unique opportunity to really bring in speakers that have direct experience, experts in the field working in service provision, housing law, and human trafficking. Today we will have the opportunity to hear from Maya Hasek. She is the Anti-Trafficking Program Director at Tapestry. That is a nonprofit social services agency that works with survivors of violence from the immigrant and refugee community. Maya helps design and provide trainings and outreach to service providers, law enforcement, and community organizations on human trafficking on the local and statewide and national basis. She also currently works in establishing collaborations and relationships with nonprofit organizations and law enforcement, specifically around the issue of human trafficking. So we're very excited to hear from her. We also have Carlo Ng. She's a staff attorney with the National Housing Law Project, and she has been focusing on the housing issues impacting survivors of domestic and sexual violence as well as trafficking. She focuses on fair housing and civil rights, and she has a focus on the special needs and housing issues of immigrants and people with limited English proficiency. Prior to joining the National Housing Law Project, Carla was an attorney with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law, and that's based in Washington, D.C. And finally, we have the opportunity to hear also from Amy Smith. She is a human trafficking expert and consultant. Amy Smith is a survivor of adult sex trafficking and commercial exploitation. Amy, in her experience, encountered multiple housing challenges during and following her exploitation. And even after escaping her first trafficker, Amy was still unable to access housing services, and this left her vulnerable to further re-victimization. She has a lot of insight into the housing process as a survivor, including missed opportunities in a domestic violence safe house. She currently serves as a survivor consultant for many organizations, including OBC-TTAC, the International Association of Human Trafficking Investigators, Freedom Network USA, and Shared Hope International, amongst others. She holds a JD and has worked to combine her survivor experience with her legal education and support the anti-trafficking work. So we're very excited to be able to hear from these three experts and look forward to being able to learn more from them. So to tell you a little bit about what we have envisioned for today, we really want to get at the basis of understanding the importance of assessing the housing needs of human trafficking survivors. What does that mean? When is it done? How can you assess for housing needs, and why is it important? We also want to make sure that you are learning the promising practices in housing assessments. How can you maintain a survivor-informed and trauma-informed work and ensure that the needs of a survivor are at the center of that assessment, but also at the center of our work. And finally, we want to navigate the housing landscape and talk about what options are available for survivors of human trafficking that include long-term, transitional, and short-term housing options. In order to learn a little bit more about you all, we want to make sure that we can learn who is on this call. We would love to hear the role that you play in your organization. So we'll give everyone a minute to fill out and participate in the poll there, so that way we can also share experiences and share examples that will be the most relevant to you. Okay, great. It seems like a lot of responses are coming in. Right now, we have a pretty good split number of definitely a lot of social workers, advocates, case managers, attorneys, admin, and then others. So we'll be really interested in learning more about that. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and stop it there. So it looks like it's a very diverse group of attendees today, and we're excited to be able to talk about these challenges and also solutions in housing, and ensure that we address it from a systemic point of view, knowing that every role has a role to play. Every role in the organization can contribute to ensuring that there is better access for long-term housing options and for stable housing options for survivors of trafficking. So we're going to go ahead and get started. First, we're going to hear from Amy Smith. She's going to talk about the importance of housing and why that is one of the priority and needs of survivors of trafficking.
Thank you. So these are kind of the basic first things that came to mind, and I think that this is, somewhat self-explanatory, and I will be providing further examples later on throughout our process with our other slides. But um, really, before anything else, housing is crucial for safety. And and that kind of hand in hand, safe housing, and safety methods for whatever type of housing situation it may be, whether it's a safe house in an undisclosed location, or whether it's a shelter situation, such as a domestic violence shelter, or other assistance with independent housing. The safety mechanism of it has to be carried through regardless of what type of housing, because without that, there's kind of no further process for a survivor to continue. If there is a constant possibility of safety being compromised, you can't move on to next steps. You can't move on to the healing process or engage fully in it. You can begin it, but without getting a sense of basic safety, there is just no real way to engage in the healing and recovery process. And so that's kind of, that leads into the healing and recovery process. And again, and I'm being kind of facetious here, saying it's a little difficult to engage in that process if you don't have stable housing, or if you're on the streets, or if you're living out of motels, or still in areas where you are being followed by people, or having difficulty extricating yourself from your trafficker, or those who are associated with them, or associated with the environment within which you were exploited. And then even a lot of times in some of, living in some of the same areas that you were exploited can be a hindrance to the healing process. And, sometimes depending on the process itself too, if you have stable and safe, secure housing, even around the area that you were exploited, that can become part of your healing process and an empowering thing. Like, I can still be around this area, and I can be safe, and I can be empowered and do the things I need to do and engage in my own recovery without, kind of getting caught back up in the exploitation, or getting pulled back into it, or having these other challenges. I can do this, and that can be an empowering thing. So that's kind of a two-sided thing, but the process has to be done correctly. And so then that goes into actually rebuilding your life, but they still go hand in hand, because the healing process is lifelong, just in different capacities, and it takes different shapes and forms, but it's a lifelong process. But actually rebuilding in terms of, self-sustainability, of course, mainly and very importantly, because of the nature of commercial sexual exploitation, or other, all types of trafficking with the financial aspects, is rebuilding processes to cement the options of having not just immediate, and, it's fine, you need to get a job now, get a job for now, and then make a plan of, but what is the long-term self-sustainability economic type plan? Like what are the options that we can work through in terms of education, other job, career interests, or things, like that you're going to go through, and then continuing to figure out how, what next steps in stable housing, going from a safe house to transitioning to the next step, to transitioning to the next step, and being able to move forward with that process. And I mean, there's so many. I said this would be short, and I know now it's not, but but there's so many different elements to the rebuilding process depending on every individual survivor. So for example, for me, I had an infant when I was first recruited into trafficking, and then by the time I was able to exit and escape a second trafficker, I had gotten pregnant with my second child. So factoring in issues that come up with children and how to keep your children safe and secure, and how to be stable for them in that process, and what, options that go along with being a mom who is a survivor. So I'll finish with that. So I hope that all made sense.
Thank you so much, Amy. That is extremely helpful. And you really illustrated the different challenges that come from not having stable housing, and how having access to safe and stable housing can really promote that healing journey for survivors. So we want to learn from organizations and from individuals on this call, what is the most common housing resource that you access with the clients that you serve? We know that oftentimes those are limited, but we'd love to hear what it is that you're currently using. You can see here that we have domestic violence shelters, homeless shelters. Some programs have the ability to have hotel stays through private funding or different types of funding. So please let us know. We'll go ahead and wait a few moments to let everyone participate. Okay, great. We're definitely getting a lot of responses from what we're seeing. There's definitely a lot of individuals who use domestic violence shelters, homeless shelters, transitional housing, a little bit lower on the public housing and apartment sharing. And a lot of individuals use all of them. So this is helpful to know that a lot of different people are using different options when it comes to housing. So here you're able to see the results. It definitely seems like domestic violence shelters are the most often utilized, and it makes sense as far as what we've seen in the field. That's very, very common, and there's no right or wrong answer when it comes to working with those different options. It really is, and what we want to emphasize is that there are a number of different options that include emergency stays, that include transitional housing, and longer term stays. What we want to emphasize is really assessing and understanding what the long-term housing goals of a survivor are, so that way they can be best matched up with something that will fit for them, but also something that they feel comfortable with, really centering that work in those options around them. We're going to go ahead and turn it back to Amy to talk more about what that assessment can look like when you're assessing for the housing needs of survivors. What does it mean to have a client-centered assessment?
Okay, so the biggest thing that I can never stress enough on a survivor-centered, client-centered, anything, whether it's law enforcement and anybody else, I can't stress enough the trust building and rapport process. And that goes back to safety, that goes back to being trauma informed, all of that stuff. And so I think that it's really important to understand that, you know, the first time you sit down with a survivor, you are not likely, and, you know, most of the time, not likely, if not all the time, on the first meeting that you have, to be able to get the answers to the questions you may have for them, or to get the information that you need, and to really get a full picture of their needs also. So it's important to kind of create these opportunities to build that rapport and to find ways of building trust, and just to, you know, and some of the ways that you can do that are I mean, just setting up small and short meetings, and I emphasize short because a lot of interactions in general, and especially depending on where a survivor is at, you know, they may be involved in a law enforcement investigation, so they're constantly having these meetings with law enforcement interviews or these other types of things, and this and that and the other. So keeping things short and sweet, but finding ways of just meeting with them to talk about other things and learn about them and who they are, besides you've been a victim of human trafficking. But what else about them? What, you know, if they have kids, you know, that's always, I mean, just, I'm a mom. It's like, you know, ask me something about my kids, I'm gonna want to talk about it. And you know, which at the same time, in the midst of trauma and disruption in your life, and depending on what's going on with the kids in the thing, that could also be a sensitive topic and a sensitive subject. But it doesn't hurt to ask if you know that they're a mom, just, you know, just to kind of mention, or even just say something, you know, positive about their role as a mother, and positive towards them, as, you know, I think it's really, I think it's really, trying to think of the word that I want to use, but something along the lines of recognizing what it takes for them to have exited and do what they need to do for their kids, whether their kids are, and I say kids because I have more than one, but, you know, kid or kids, whether their kids are with them at the time or not, or whether they don't know what's going to happen in the process of what's going on, but just to kind of give them that sense of, I think it's really brave, or awesome, or whatever, that you are, you know, you've had the courage to take all of these steps to start a new life, and to try to figure out ways of doing this, and doing that for your kids, and, you know, being the best mom that you can for them, because that shows that you're, you know, you're being a good mom, and you are. I think with survivors who have kids, that can be something that, you know, I wish somebody would have said to me, for sure. And especially because it is extremely common, and it was a huge factor in my case, that my child at the time was used as a means of coercion. And so there's a lot of blame that goes along with that. But besides that, anything in general, just about even just random things about themselves, what they like, or just whatever they may feel comfortable just talking about, but just building that rapport. And that can take, a couple little small meetings doing that. And it can take multiple ones before you actually get into the assessment and getting the information that you really need. But if you do that and you're giving the effort, that survivor is going to see that. And even if, it doesn't always go well, they're going to see, well, this person really tried with me, or they tried to get to know me. They might, they don't understand what I've been through, and they might not be able to understand where I'm at, but at least they tried, and they put that effort there. And so they'll be more willing to engage with you to go through the process. And it'll make it easier for them to kind of understand what the assessment means and how to try to respond. And I think that that first bullet point, taking the time to understand the survivor's needs, is the time factor of that is also very important, because a lot of times we don't, especially in the midst of things, and often for long after, we don't, as survivors, necessarily know, or we might know somewhere in the back of our mind, but we can't access that. But we don't necessarily know what we really do need. What exactly is it? And so kind of getting to that through different questions is a good way to do that. And also just because of the nature of exploitation and trafficking is, the process of just as a human being controlled by a trafficker and other people, well, you don't know what you want. You don't know what you need. I'll tell you, I tell you this or that, or I'm the one who decides these things. And so that really sinks in to your brain and your decision-making ability. So besides not being able to access those things, it's also a sense of, well, I might think I need this, but I'm sure I'm wrong, or I can't possibly make that decision or express what I need. So that's kind of just an expansion on that particular element. I mean, kind of confidentiality, I don't feel like that's necessarily something that I need to expand upon. I can't imagine anyone here doesn't recognize the importance of that, especially in the types of cases like this and the high risk, often, what's the word, high lethality, lethal, however that word goes, cases and things like that, where confidentiality besides that being a professional responsibility, it's something that is, just to me, it's just kind of obvious. And I think the only thing I would say on that point is just explaining to the survivor their rights with confidentiality, or what that kind of means, and making sure that they know that. And I think that's something that should definitely be done from the beginning, so they understand the confidentiality aspects, and that can also help build that trust. And Yeah, I think that's mainly it for me on this one.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy. We really appreciate you being able to share that experience and being able to share those recommendations, especially having that lived experience. It's helpful for service providers to understand kind of that perspective that sometimes we don't get after the fact. So that's extremely helpful. Next, we're going to hear from Maya. She's going to talk to us a little bit more about the assessment itself and assessing for housing needs. So what does that look like? When does it occur? And she'll be able to dive more into that.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. Just to say a little bit about the housing assessment. We are all familiar with the needs assessment that occurs immediately after we have received a referral for a potential victim of human trafficking. But housing, as you know, is something that many of us struggle with as far as a lack of resources and long-term placement. But we want to, today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about emergency housing and the assessment for both emergency and long-term. So as you may already know, we receive referrals for survivors needing services at many different stages. Sometimes we receive a referral from law enforcement that has conducted a raid. Other times we may receive a referral from, let's say, a domestic violence shelter or a domestic violence program that is already serving a victim of human trafficking. And other times we may receive a referral, let's say, for a survivor that has obtained a T visa and seems to be settled in the United States. So regardless of where your referral is coming from and whether or not the survivor that you're working with is a U.S. citizen or a foreign national, a housing assessment should be conducted, not only when initially you receive the referral, but on an ongoing basis. Some individuals would suggest that a housing assessment should be conducted on a continuous basis and on a monthly basis. We oftentimes think that, even if the client is living with family members or living with a friend, that they are stable and they don't need that type of assistance, and we quickly shift to other needs that a survivor may have: medical, counseling, food, clothing, immigration, or legal. But we're doing this webinar just to say that it is important to do these assessments on an ongoing basis as the housing needs of a survivor may change over time. Maybe initially they had stable housing, but in a week or so, or a week after a referral, their housing situation may have changed. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. All right, thank you. So what should a housing assessment include? Well, our focus should primarily be on safety. Where did the human trafficking occur? How long ago did it occur? Was the trafficker arrested? Is the trafficker still in state or in the country? And of course, talking to the survivor about how they feel about their safety. Amy made a really good point about saying that if you place a survivor, or specifically in her situation, she felt that could be re-triggering. But she also mentioned that if she lived close to the trafficking situation, that was something that was empowering to her. So of course, we want to look at safety, but we don't want to jump to conclusions and say we know what the best situation is. The survivor is the expert of his or her situation. But not only should we focus on the safety when it comes to the trafficking situation, but we should focus on other safety factors. does the survivor have experience living in that location, whether that is a shelter or independent living? How do they feel about that city or that state? It may be necessary to even assist the survivor in relocating out of state. So these are just a few questions that you may want to consider in incorporating into your housing assessment. Is the placement in a safe area? Does the survivor feel safe? Is the survivor ready for independent living? Additional barriers that you may choose to screen for are things that may have led to the survivor becoming homeless. Is there an income situation? Is there a family situation that prevents the survivor from seeking other form of housing? Is there substance use that needs to be treated prior to the survivor moving into a more stabilizing housing situation? So next, please. Okay. Additional considerations would include, for the housing that you have available for the survivors that you are working with, is there a requirement for certain documentation? Regardless of if you're working with a U.S. citizen or a foreign national, some shelters or some places or some apartments may require a social security card. They may require an ID, and maybe a form of control that the trafficker exerted, would have been taking away the survivor's identification and documents, which has kept them, homeless or dependent on the trafficker. So that might be something that you may need to handle prior to jumping into looking for long-term housing. Of course, when we're looking at apartments, certain apartments do have a requirement for immigration status. Other apartments also have a background check requirement, and the individuals that we're working with might have an arrest record. Therefore, maybe even assistance with vacating convictions prior to them being eligible to enter into certain apartment complexes. Like Amy mentioned, there might be additional reasons why a survivor does not want to relocate, and a child might be one of those reasons. It would not be fit for us to offer housing for a survivor in a shelter where they only assist, let's say single females or single males, if that survivor has children that are dependent on them. So that would not be a solution for that individual. We also want to consider maybe their medical appointments. Maybe there's a specific doctor where the client has appointments and they just want to be closer to that area until their treatment is complete. And the same goes for counseling. We definitely don't want to uproot somebody and say, you can no longer attend those counseling sessions because we're going to be relocating you across town. So that's something that we need to consider, as well as a lack of, transportation. Is there public transportation available? Does the survivor have a car, a driver license? And can our case managers provide the transportation for the client to be able to attend medical appointments, counseling appointments with attorneys if the shelter or that housing option is, further away? Additionally, we want to think about the financial constraints. Let's say there's nothing as far as paperwork, a background check that keeps the survivor from getting an apartment. Well, if that apartment is, $1,000 a month and the survivor, has a job that pays $900, then we're really setting them up for failure if we don't think of that situation long term. How is the survivor going to be able to afford this? And then, of course, the wishes of the survivor. Do they want to relocate to that area? They should have a final say in, any type of services that are rendered to them. And we also want to think about program restrictions. If we are thinking about short-term housing, such as a domestic violence shelter or even a trafficking shelter, we want to think about their restrictions as far as, do they accept survivors with certain substance use? So does the survivor need to go into detox prior to being relocated there, as well as rules about, cell phone use. I've heard about shelters that, say that the survivor cannot bring their cell phone into the shelter. So that prior to referring a client to a place like that, we need to make sure that the survivor is aware of those restrictions. This is going to be traumatizing to them. We certainly don't want to take away their choice. So even though that shelter or that place where there is a curfew and the limitation on use of cell phone, even though they have those rules, it might still be a good option, but that's something that we need to discuss with the survivor prior to making a referral. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've kind of been hinting at this as some of the short-term or emergency housing options. So we can go ahead and I will suggest a few. So this is not, always the best option for everybody, but it's certainly something that can be utilized for a 1-night, 2-night, or even a 1-month stay. There are trafficking-specific shelters out there that do cater to survivors of human trafficking, and we can refer there, but we as service providers need to be aware of who do they accept. Is it males? Is it females? Is it children? Is it individuals with children? We may also choose to utilize domestic violence shelters, as many of you have hinted that is an option and something that you have already utilized. Homeless shelters are kind of an option of last resort for my agency, as most homeless shelters, are open to first come, first served basis. Some homeless shelters will say, come at night at a certain time and leave in the morning. So that's really not a long-term solution for anybody. While other homeless shelters, there are benefits of going that route, as it does lead to more long-term housing and opens up more doors for transitional housing for survivors. And there are also certain shelters that will allow a survivor to stay there for a month or even 2 months while accessing other services such as addiction and as well as counseling, as well as employment type services. But in order for you to know which shelters are good for your clients, or that you would refer your clients to, you of course need to have those conversations with the shelter and need to be aware of what the limitations are. Hotels are also kind of last resort, but when you're working with survivors of labor trafficking, specifically males, and you don't have many options, hotels might be a good choice for you. Now, of course, hotels can be re-traumatizing and might not be a good option for everybody. And then apartment sharing is also an option. So if we can go to the next slide, please. As I have hinted to some of the challenges that these short-term or emergency housing options may have, certain shelters may cater to, specific gender or specific age range. So you, like I said, you need to be aware of those limitations. Domestic violence shelters, I've heard that some, I know most of them do have that 32 to 90 day stay limitations. And once that's done, there should be a long-term solution available for the survivor. Additionally, some domestic violence shelters may say, your trafficker needs to be an intimate partner. So if you're referring, a victim of labor trafficking, I would suggest to do a training for that shelter so that they would be more open to accepting your clients. And like I mentioned, for homeless shelters, first come, first serve, and not always the best option. When it comes to apartment sharing, you really need to be aware of who you're placing with, together. And I would suggest that if you're placing two survivors, or let's say a refugee and a survivor, that they meet ahead of time and talk to each other and ensure that they're okay with sharing an apartment and living with each other for however long they would be placed. And a reason for apartment sharing at times would be, let's say you have a person that could get a lease in their name while your client maybe has a felony, and that's something that you're working to assist them with, clearing from their record. Let's say your client is a foreign national and their immigration documents have not come in, and therefore they cannot get an apartment in their name. But having 6-month period sharing an apartment with somebody, that could be a good option for them. But like I said, there needs to be a discussion prior to two individuals being put in the same apartment. Sometimes personalities don't match. Sometimes country backgrounds and culture don't match well. So the survivor needs to make that decision. So I believe that Carlo is up next with rapid rehousing.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Maya. So we are going to go over a couple of housing programs today, and we'll start with rapid rehousing. What is rapid rehousing? Rapid rehousing is a homeless crisis response program that quickly moves people off the streets by providing housing location services, move-in assistance, and short-term rental subsidies. Rapid rehousing is a key component of a housing-first approach to ending homelessness. There are basically 3 components to the program, the first being housing location or helping the client find a suitable place to live. The program also provides moving costs, including the first and last rent, deposit, and other related expenses, and then short-term rental subsidies. The program also provides case management services. It depends on the program, but generally speaking, the rental subsidies last somewhere between 3 and 24 months. Eligibility for rapid rehousing depends on the individual program. Generally, the programs are designed for people that are currently homeless or are at risk of being homeless. Next slide, please. Rapid rehousing is designed as a strategy for securing housing for individuals and families that would be able to maintain housing and its costs after the program period ends. It is not designed for individuals and families that require ongoing financial support or for whom self-sufficiency is not a realistic goal. A rapid rehousing program can be just that, rapid, moving an individual or family from the streets and into stable housing in a short amount of time. While rapid rehousing programs provide some case management, the services that are provided will be insufficient to meet the needs of many trafficking survivors, and anti-trafficking organizations should remain engaged with the survivor they are serving. A good place to start in terms of trying to access the rapid rehousing program and figuring out what kinds of short-term to long-term options are available to the clients you work with is to reach out to your local public housing authority or continuous care to find these programs. And I see actually in the chat box someone actually already suggested that, which is awesome because they have had experience at their local COC in collaboration with the local domestic violence shelter to provide short-term shelter to their clients. Next slide, please. Now we're going to transition to talking about long-term and permanent housing options. Obviously, short-term and emergency options are incredibly important for the clients that you work with. It's also incredibly important to talk or to start thinking about long-term housing options that can support your clients. Next slide. Why is long-term and permanent housing so important? I think this is fairly self-explanatory and logical. Affordable and stable housing is crucial to increasing safety, good health, children's success in school, sustaining good employment, and just overall maintaining self-sufficiency. And here, Amy, if you don't mind saying a few words about the importance of also having long-term support services.
Sure. I think that the nature of this crime and a lot of the chaos that can be going on, it's understandable why typically most often our focus is on immediate, emergent housing, this right now, this happening now, a short-term kind of option that may not lead to better long-term and better long-term options and options that, in that sense, that lead to building that self-sufficiency for the survivor within themselves. I mean, them being able to feel like they are building that and those things. And I just think that it's people really underestimate the long-term effects of this crime and the fact that you can have so many ups and downs and setbacks after, you get, stable, and then there's this setback or that setback, or there's different things happening with a case, and, or, you could be in your own, apartment, however long after you've exited from the exploitation and been able to get assistance and start rebuilding and, be in your own apartment or your own home, or have all of these different stable, or at least seemingly stable type of things in your life happening, and still face multiple setbacks or, certain major setbacks. And so I think the issue with that, and just kind of my main point, because I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but the main point that I want to express with that is just, we really cannot underestimate the long-term effects of this crime, and so the long-term needs of survivors, even if, say in a sense of a case manager or a victim advocate, if you haven't heard from the survivor, the case is going well, or you haven't heard from them, there's no need to contact them or something, contact them. But keeping that door open, that, if something comes up later, no matter if it's one, week, month, year, 2 years, no matter the amount of time, you can reach back out to me. I will do what I can to connect you to resources, and just always leave that open door. And that was something that I can say was beneficial to me, because most of my housing experiences were missed opportunities. But what I can say that was beneficial to me was my victim advocate always having that open door, no matter what it was about, or no matter what was happening with the case, any of those kinds of things. And so I can't stress enough the fact that we have to resist underestimating the long-term effects of this crime. Years and years and years down the road, you can come up to a setback and feel like you have no options. What are you supposed to do? Well, I'm not being trafficked anymore. It's been 5 years since I was trafficked. Why would somebody help me? Why should I, be able to reach out for help or trying to do so? And because people do underestimate the long-term effects, then they are not responsive to that particular survivor, or, well, there's nothing we can do for you. Or, so I think that the long-term effects within housing and within so many areas is something that is kind of one of those gaps that we have going on in the anti-trafficking efforts right now. So I want to make that really clear.
Thank you, Amy. Those are really important points you're making about how the long-term trauma is real, and so therefore having long-term support services is incredibly important if we really want to make sure that folks not only can access housing, but maintain it in the long run. So thank you. Next slide, please. Why is housing so unaffordable? This graphic tries to explain why, but in a nutshell, it's because the incomes of many renters have not kept pace with the housing costs. So here in this graph, you see that for about over 13 years, the median gross rent increased by 6%, whereas the median renter household income decreased by 9%. Next slide, please. What affordable housing programs are available? There are actually quite a few affordable housing programs that are available both on the federal, state, and local levels. Today, we are just focusing on 4 federal programs, specifically public housing, Section 8 housing choice vouchers, project-based Section 8, and the low-income housing tax credit program, because these are for the big ones that you'll hear about that are operated by the federal government. But I also want you to keep in mind that there are many state and local funded housing assistance programs that survivors and other folks who are low income can access. The great thing about some of these state and local programs is that many of them do not have immigration status requirements. So for example, in Massachusetts, they run a public housing program that does not have any immigration status requirements, which is really great for those who have issues with their immigration status. But for today, we're just going to focus on the 4 federal programs listed on this slide. Next slide, please. Why is affordable housing hard to find? Yes, very good question. Basically, it's because the federal funding for the affordable housing programs have decreased significantly. In this chart here, you see that basically since the mid-1990s, the rental assistance expansion has significantly decreased. And so basically, there's not enough housing stock to meet the demand. And so here you see the steady decline of rental assistance expansion since the 1990s, and unfortunately, with our current Congress and administration, that is only going to continue. Next slide, please. This is a basic chart that shows you basically how many units we're talking about in the millions. For the 4 housing programs we're going to discuss, the Rural Development Multifamily Program, which is the last bar you see, is a program that's operated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture within the Office of Rural Development. They basically provide rental assistance for low-income folks too in rural areas, but we're not going to talk about that program. If folks are interested, we have a project that is focused on rural development subsidies, so happy to talk about the basics of that program, and if you want to know how to access those units, feel free to contact me. But today we're really focusing on the programs, the first 4 programs listed here in the first 4 bars. And so the main takeaway is that the biggest housing program that we have right now that's an affordable housing program on the federal level is the low-income housing tax credit program. And then second is a Section 8 voucher program. What is public housing? Public housing is owned and operated by public housing authorities. Sometimes they're also called public housing agencies. We'll use the acronym PHA here for short throughout the presentation. The public housing program provides deep rental subsidies for very poor families in our country. Rents are generally set at 30% of a family's adjusted income. It's not gross income. There are certain deductions that are made from the gross income in order to arrive to the adjusted income. So it's 30% of a family's adjusted income. How does the public housing program generally work? Who funds it? Who owns it? So Congress provides federal dollars to HUD, specifically HUD's Office on Public and Indian Housing. HUD has a couple of different offices, and depending on those offices, they operate different programs. For public housing, we're talking about the Office of Public and Indian Housing. And the funds are given in the form of operating capital funds. These dollars are then given out to public housing authorities that operate public housing units. An important note here is that not every public housing agency operates public housing. So for example, where on the East Coast where I grew up, where there is a lot of public housing and most public housing authorities run both the public housing program and then later I will talk about the Section 8 voucher program. On the West Coast, when I moved out here, I learned that actually many housing authorities out here do not have public housing stock, but they have a lot of Section 8 voucher programs, and some housing authorities have both programs. Housing authorities then use the funds that they get from HUD to provide subsidies to public housing tenants. The arrangement between HUD and the public housing authorities, they're usually memorialized in agreements or contracts called the annual contributions contracts. And then of course, when you have a public housing authority as a landlord and a tenant, there's a lease involved. There's some house rules about what a tenant can and cannot do, the obligations of a landlord, here it's the housing authority, etc. Who lives in public housing? There's about 1.1 million units nationwide of public housing. Within those units, about 3.3 million children live in public housing. 31% of those residents are seniors or over above the age of 62. 30% of those households include family members under the age of 62 who are experiencing a disability. 65% are considered extremely low income, which is defined as an income less than 30% of area median income. The average national annual income of public housing residents is $14,496, so about $15,000 or $500. Some public housing buildings can be designated for families, seniors, and persons experiencing disabilities. Low-income residents include folks who are low income, defined as less than 80% of area median income, or very low income, which is less than 50% of area median income. So we're really talking about folks who are very poor. There are also other eligibility requirements that we're not going to go into detail today because of the time constraint, but just keep in mind that the housing authority also takes into account certain assets that a family has. Immigration status is a big one. There are specific immigration status requirements in the public housing program, but importantly, certain victims of trafficking are excluded from those immigration status requirements. So if you get a T visa, you would be excluded from the immigration status requirements. Social Security numbers are also required for folks who are subsidized by the public housing programs, and there are other requirements too. We are in the process of developing a fact sheet that will give you an overview and also some highlights of the public housing program. It has not been published yet, but just know that it's in the hopper and please look out for that. How do you apply for public housing? You apply by going to your local public housing authority in your area. If you don't know where your housing authorities are, you can go to that website right there, and you can apply in person, so certainly you can just go to the office and ask for an application. For some housing authorities, depending on how sophisticated they are in terms of their technology, this application can be online. You can also submit it via mail. really important, the wait lists for many of these programs are really, really long. And so oftentimes the wait lists are closed for a number of years because those wait lists are so long. And so you really need to wait for the wait list to open in order to apply, which means that there is no, for example, an annual date every year that you can apply for public housing or other programs. You just have to receive notice of that the program is accepting applications for a certain period of time and then apply at that point. Some public housing authorities have admissions preferences where they adopt local preferences for applicants. So there are preferences, for example, for homeless families, folks with disabilities, and certain crime victims. And a lot of times crime victims does include survivors of trafficking and also survivors of domestic violence. We really encourage folks who apply and work with housing authorities to not just apply for one program. When they're working with the housing authority, to be sure to ask for other programs that might be available to the applicant based on the characteristics of the applicant. So for example, housing authorities often operate public housing, Section 8 vouchers, project-based Section 8 vouchers, which is a subset of the voucher program. And there are also some homeless assistance programs that the housing authority can operate in conjunction with other agencies as well. So definitely inquire about those to increase the number of housing options that might be available to your clients. We're going to talk about the voucher program now. This program is kind of called different things. Officially, it's called the Housing Choice Voucher Program. People have also called it the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. People also call it Section 8, which is a little bit confusing because the term Section 8 actually involves many, many different programs aside from the voucher program. So here we'll call it the voucher program. HUD provides funds to public housing agency to administer the voucher program locally. Within the voucher program, how it operates is that a tenant gets a voucher and then the tenant goes into the private market to find a private landlord who will take the voucher and therefore be a part of the voucher program so that the tenant can use the voucher in that unit. Most tenants pay 30% of adjusted income. Although that can vary a little bit, the tenant contribution, which actually includes utilities, that's a really important point because it's not just the rent, but it's the rent plus the allowance for tenant paid utilities. So the tenant contribution for someone who's new to the voucher program cannot exceed 40% of the tenant's income. So 40% is really the cap of how much they should be contributing. A unique characteristic of the voucher program is that you can move with it. Some folks here might be familiar with these terms, mobility and portability, but basically with a voucher, anyone who gets a voucher, they can move with their voucher. They can move within the same complex, just another unit within the complex, or they could take their voucher and port with it. And what that means is that they can go outside of the jurisdiction of the original housing authority that gave them the voucher and use that voucher in that new place. So for example, if I get a voucher from the Sacramento Housing Authority and I want to move to the Boston Housing Authority in Massachusetts, so long as the housing authority will take my voucher, I can use my voucher there. Who is eligible for vouchers? Families with incomes below 50% of area median income are eligible. There are also a host of other eligibility requirements, some of which are very similar to the ones that I mentioned under the public housing program. So again, the same immigration restrictions that apply to the public housing program apply here. And there is an exception for survivors of trafficking. Social Security numbers are also required for folks seeking vouchers. They also look at assets and other requirements as well. How do you apply for Housing Choice Voucher? You would apply by going to your local housing authority. Again, you can do it online, in person, via email. The waiting list for the voucher programs can be incredibly long. And that is something that as advocates we need to be aware of, and also in serving the people that we serve, make sure that we manage expectations, because disappointment can be very triggering for a lot of folks. The wait list for the voucher program can be as long as 5 to 7 years. That's not true across the board, but for many, many housing authorities, that's true, which means the wait lists don't open very often. And when they do, there's a long line of people who wait. Some housing authorities have admission preferences, which is good, because admission preferences will get you bumped up on the waiting list. So if they have, for example, a preference for crime victims that includes trafficking survivors, great. That'll save you a couple of years, if not more, on that wait list. And again, apply for as many programs as you can. Inquire, work with the housing authority, describe the situation that your client is in, or your client can describe their situation, and really emphasize the urgent need for this person to be housed. This is a graph that depicts how important vouchers can be in reducing family homelessness and reducing housing instability. And we all know that housing stability generally is incredibly critical to self-sufficiency, and vouchers is one part of that. But housing stability generally is incredibly important in determining life outcomes for many families. This next graph shows basically how families who have taken vouchers and moved out of neighborhoods that are considered to be lower poverty neighborhoods improves adult outcomes. So basically, there are families who have taken their vouchers and gone to areas that are sometimes called higher opportunity areas. These are areas that might have better jobs, they have better schools, they have better transit. And there have been some studies that have shown that when tenants take advantage of the portability feature of the voucher program and basically move into better neighborhoods, they have better life outcomes. We're going to spend a little bit of time to talk about project-based Section 8. Some folks don't tend to be that familiar with this program, and when folks hear Section 8, I think people generally think of the Section 8 voucher program and not so much project-based Section 8. So we'll take a couple of minutes here to go over what project-based Section 8 is. With project-based Section 8, an owner enters into a housing assistance payments contract with HUD, and so the rental assistance is attached to the property. It's stuck with the unit. It does not move with the tenant. So that obviously is very different from the voucher program where we just said that the tenant can move with the voucher. Project-based Section 8, the subsidy is attached to the unit. The tenant enters into a lease with the owner and then pays the affordable rent. And then HUD pays the owner a subsidy to cover the difference between the tenant's share and the total contract rent. How much rent is paid? Okay, we have a little hypo here. Tenants usually pay 30% of adjusted income, so very similar to the public housing program and also the voucher program. Utility allowances are also accounted for, so let's talk about this using Tom. So Tom tenant who rents a project-based Section 8 unit has a monthly adjusted income of $1,000. Tom also gets $50 per month utility allowance, so what would Tom pay per month? So 30% of Tom's adjusted income is $300, so you would take $300 and you subtract from that the $50 for which Tom gets a utility allowance, and you'd get $250, and then Tom would actually pay the $250 and not $300, which is 30% of his adjusted income. So this is just an important example to keep in mind that it's not just income, but also what the utilities cost, and that the utility cost should be paid for as part of the subsidy, and that cost should not be given to the tenant who is in the unit. Who is eligible for project-based Section 8? Very low-income folks or folks who are earning less than 50% of area median income. Again, the same immigration status requirements apply here, as well as Social Security number requirements. And the owner here, not the housing authority, because again, we're talking about project-based Section 8. There's no public housing authority involved here. The folks who are involved here are private entities, both the landlord, and if the landlord is different from the owner is also a private entity. So the owner or landlord would be looking at the assets of the person. How do you apply for project-based Section 8? You know, it's not that easy because the units are not centered within a government agency like a public housing agency. Sometimes getting a list of units that are operated by private landlords that are receiving subsidies, it's really hard to get that inventory list. But one good way is to ask your public housing agency. Many housing agencies, even if they don't operate the programs, they will know of other property managers that operate these programs because they often share property management companies. So say like a property management company that is managing public housing units or voucher units that the housing authority is administering, they could also be operating or managing project-based Section 8 units, tax credit units, etc. A lot of times these project management companies are huge, they're nationwide, and so they do all kinds of project management. Waiting lists, yes, there are also waiting lists for the project-based Section 8 program, although they tend not to be as long as they tend to be for the voucher program and public housing program. And there can also be admissions preferences as well. So definitely look into that when you are applying for all of these programs. There is a link that I think we're going to share. So Avantika, I don't know if you can just put that link to the HUD.gov website. Basically, if you go to that website, it gives you the link to how to identify housing authorities in your area. There's also a search mechanism within HUD, and you'll see there where you can search for Section 8 properties, and it's project-based Section 8. And what that'll give you is that'll give you a list of the inventory. It won't give you the units that, it's not real time, so it's not going to give you units where there are vacancies right now, but it'll give you a list of all of the subsidized, HUD subsidized units in that area. So that'll give you a starting point to really do the research for finding these kinds of units for your clients. We're going to switch gears a little bit to talk about the low-income housing tax credit program. The tax credit program is different in many ways. It is not a program administered by HUD. It is a program administered by the IRS. That is sometimes surprising to people. We didn't know that the IRS operated affordable housing programs. They do, and this, as we saw in the graphic earlier, is also one of the largest affordable housing programs. Actually, it is the largest federal affordable housing program in our country. There are currently more than 2.4 million tax credit units. The properties are privately owned and managed. Over 90% of new affordable housing construction is financed by tax credits. Tax credits are also a favorite of conservatives because it involves the injection of private funds to provide subsidized housing. The IRS administers the program by relying on state housing finance agencies. So basically, there are agencies in every state whose sole responsibility is to administer and operate the low-income housing tax credit. Depending on what state you're in, the name of the housing finance agency can differ. So you can actually go onto a website to figure out where your state housing finance agency, what its name is and what information they have. So I can provide that after the webinar. What is the role of state housing finance agencies? So basically the IRS distributes tax credit allocations to the state housing finance agencies, and then the state finance agencies use a competitive bidding process to award these credits to developers. And I apologize that this is getting kind of technical, so just please bear with me. So let's go over that again. The IRS distributes tax credits to state housing finance agencies using a specific formula. It's a per capita formula. Then the state finance agency uses a competitive bidding process to award credits to developers. The developer, some of the developers get awarded the tax credit allocation, and then the tax credits are collected over a 10-year period. And then during that 10-year period, the owner of the development and the landlord, they have to keep the rents affordable during that period of time. The developer then uses those tax credits to build and operate the project. For tax credit developments, at least 20% of those units have to be rent restricted and occupied by families that make equal or less than 50% of area median income. Or they can also they have to have at least 40% of units that are rent restricted and occupied by families that make less than or equal to 50% of area median income. And it's very common for developers to exceed these minimums. Rents are capped at rates affordable to families making between 30 to 60% of area median income. A really important distinction here is that while the tax credit program is considered to be an affordable housing program, it's not a program that typically benefits the very, very poor. And a lot of that has to do with the way the programs are designed. In the public housing context, we're talking about 30% of an individual person or household's adjusted income and figuring out how much they pay based on their individualized income. Here in the tax credit program, it's not about individualized income and looking at how much people make as an individual. Here, the rents are capped at looking at 30 to 60% of the general area median income. That's how they're capped. It doesn't really matter how much the person is making. Well, it does matter, but the way that the formula is calculated, it looks at the 30 to 60% of the area median income. So it's not a true subsidy in that it doesn't provide a deep subsidy for the very poor, but it is better than many market rents, especially out here in the Bay Area where the market is very hot. Who is eligible for this program? Applicants have to meet the income limit for the unit. The project cannot discriminate against housing choice voucher participants. So some housing choice voucher folks, so people who have vouchers, actually go to complexes where there are tax credit units to try to lease up with a landlord who is operating a tax credit project. And with those sort of various layers of financing with the tax credits and the vouchers, that makes it truly affordable for someone who is very poor. Importantly, there are no immigration status requirements for the tax credit project. And you will probably hear conflicting things about this because what sometimes happens is that even though there are no federal immigration status requirements, because the program is for the most part run by the state, because remember again, the state housing finance agencies basically administer these programs, and then the landlords, the folks who get the tax credits and then ultimately operate these units, they set up their own rules, and sometimes there are misunderstandings about how to do so. There are assumptions that, oh, I operate a federal housing program or I have a subsidy from a federal agency. There must be immigration status requirements. I must have to ask for social security numbers or ask for green cards or whatever. That's not correct. For the federal tax credit program, there are no immigration status requirements. There are also state tax credit programs, and state tax credit programs are obviously run by the state, and so whether or not immigration status requirements have those for those programs is up to the state, but there are none for the federal tax credit program. How do you apply for tax credit? It's also not very straightforward. I would recommend as a first step to ask your local public housing authorities, because again, they will know of other kinds of housing that you could apply for and give you perhaps a good referral. Some state housing finance agencies also have lists of tax credit developments and where they're located. Sometimes it's online. If you go to their office, they could also give that to you as well. And again, just apply for multiple programs when possible. The waiting lists for many of these programs are incredibly long, so you increase your chances of getting housing assistance if you apply for several programs at the same time. And then to close it out, we are going to do a poll to see how much information you have retained. So which program does not have immigration status requirements? Is it public housing, housing choice voucher program, project-based Section 8, or the tax credit program? Okay. Oh, excellent. Most of you were paying attention. That's awesome. You got it right. So it's the tax credit program that does not have any immigration requirements. All the other programs we talked about, public housing, vouchers, and project-based Section 8, do have immigration requirements. Really importantly, I did talk about rapid rehousing in the beginning. There are no immigration requirements for that program right now.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Carlo. And we want to acknowledge that there is so much expertise that she's bringing and that she's able to share, and also acknowledge that that is a lot of information to retain. So well done for those that were able to get that poll question correctly. For those that are still unsure, we will be sharing this webinar and the slides after, so no worries, you can review the information there. And just if it felt like it was a lot of information, it was. And really the concept and the idea behind this initial webinar was really to give you an introduction to these types of resources, specifically around housing, so that we will be building upon these and going and diving deeper into specific topics. So just know that there are additional webinars coming out and additional materials such as fact sheets and tools that will be able to help you as you explore and understand these options better. We do have quite a few questions that came up. Unfortunately, we're out of time. So what we're going to do is, if you could please email us, we'll put our information up here. Oops, sorry, it went back. But we're going to put our email information up here so you can email us. We know that there was a lot of great questions, so we want to make sure that anything that you're curious on, that we're able to answer that. It seems like the information went out, but basically we're going to type it in the chat box. It's training@freedomnetworkusa.org. Please feel free to reach out to us. We'll be reaching out to you in an email and making sure that we have the link to this webinar. Feel free to share with your colleagues, as well as a sample housing assessment from our partners at Heartland Alliance, based out of Chicago. So we want to make sure that you can see an example of what other human trafficking or anti-human trafficking programs are utilizing. And that way it doesn't have to be, that's not the only option, but it can kind of give you a concept visually what it looks like. We want you to keep in touch. Like we mentioned, we'll be reaching out again, and we would love for you to take a second to be able to fill out a survey. We want to know what topics around housing and human trafficking are important to you. We want to understand the needs that you're currently facing as a service provider. And when we say service provider, that's professionals working alongside survivors of human trafficking, with survivors of human trafficking, and any of those allied fields. So we just want to make sure that we know what the needs are, so that way we can respond to those. We've definitely been keeping very close attention to what is happening, what the housing landscape looks like in those challenges. So we want to be responsive. You can expect to have bi-monthly webinars on our end. And what we're going to be focusing on is having follow-up calls that will allow some troubleshooting and talking through some more in-depth questions. So that way we're able to learn as a field. Some of the upcoming topics that we're going to be delivering materials on and webinars on is working with continuums of care, rapid rehousing, specifically as it applies to survivors of trafficking, public housing authorities, working with landlords. So even after a survivor has identified a place how they can finally lease up, working with shelters housing for youth, trafficked youth, housing for males, as well as foreign nationals, especially thinking about when undocumented individuals are not able to access due to their immigration status. So we want to make sure that you know that these are resources that are going to be coming out. If you have other areas that you're interested in accessing resources, please let us know. And if you have access to tools and resources that you think would be helpful for other service providers, please send them our way. We would love to be able to share them with the group. Please respond to the survey so that way we're able to get that feedback and implement it and respond real time to you all. We want to thank you so much for coming to this webinar. We want to thank our panelists. They were amazing, and our coordinator, Avantika, who has done an excellent job. If you have questions, please reach out, and we'll be talking in the next webinar. Thank you.